My name is Humphrey Tonkin. I chair the board of the Esperantic Studies Foundation and also chair the study group on language and the United Nations. A couple of years ago, we received a grant from the Soros family to do a series of lectures in memory of Tivadar Soros, George Soros's father. Tivadar Soros was a very interesting person. He wrote two remarkable books in the international language Esperanto. The first of them on World War I and his experiences as a prisoner of war in Siberia, and the second on World War II, when he and his family survived the war as Jews living in Budapest, Hungary. The goal of the lectures was to highlight the work of scholars in the New York area on Esperanto and planned language. And we put together a group of some 6 lectures. 5 of them were actually given at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And as a result of that, we felt that it would be a good idea to try to go back and talk to the various lecturers about their lectures and about the work that they're doing. The first talk was given by Esther Schor, who is here in the studio with me. She is Leonard L. Milberg Professor of American Jewish Studies and Professor of English at Princeton University. And her book, Bridge of Words, Esperanto and the Dream of a Universal Language, was published by Metropolitan Books in 2016. So, Esther.
Yes.
Bridge of Words. Why Bridge of Words?
It was the metaphor used by the creator of Esperanto, Ludwig Lazarus Zamenhof, who had as a kind of life dream the idea of using language to bring people together.
Yeah.
His observation as a Jew growing up in multi-ethnic Bialystok, he was born in 1859, was that language was a barrier between people. There were Germans and Poles and Jews, Russians, and everyone spoke a different language. And he was firmly convinced throughout his life that if language barriers could be broken down, then people would understand one another better. There wouldn't spontaneously be world harmony, but it would be the beginning of important conversations.
And dream of a universal language. So that was sort of that was the dream he had.
It was a dream, but it was a very ancient dream.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea of a language that was not given to misinterpretation. I mean, this goes back to the story of Babel, and there are other cultures that also have myths of linguistic difference. The idea of making a perfect language, a divine language that was, divinely given and uncorrupted. And Zamenhof was a modern man. I mean, he was an emancipated Jew living in an age of great modernization and progress. New networks were being put in, transportation, communication. And he took this ancient dream and sort of gave it a modern twist and proposed it as a mark of progress to progressive people. Yeah. And people could learn this language quickly. Yes. It was entirely regular and made of familiar phonemes and morphemes from European languages. And you could sort of get going quickly and start communicating.
And the book, so the book's now been out for 2 years, right?
The book came out in 2016. Yeah.
And how's it been received?
The book has been well received, and I'm very grateful for that. It was delayed in the production a bit, so that I learned that it would come out about 3 weeks before the election of 2016, the fateful election of 2016, and I thought this would just sink the book, But on the contrary, all of the op-eds and editorials at the time were about polarization and this nation of red states and blue states and red voters and blue voters, and people couldn't speak to each other across this abyss. And in walked my book about this being a perennial issue, and one person among others who tried to address it. So the book was sort of created in that mood at that moment.
So provided a certain amount of relief, maybe, actually.
Or a little place for hope, perhaps.
Right, right. It's interesting, actually, because Masquerade, and you know, of course, that I translated both Masquerade and Crusoe's in Siberia, which was the other Tivadar Soros book. Masquerade came out within days of 9/11, and the British edition, which came out a year earlier, was very successful.
Yeah.
But the American edition, at the beginning at least, sort of sank like a stone, but then reappeared. And the book is still in print, and now has been translated into a total of 11 languages.
Yes, it's remarkable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, the story of Masquerade, and we can come back to that maybe in a moment, is still very much out there, which is nice. Now, not only are you a historian and a specialist in English literature, but you're also a poet. What's the connection between poetry and Esperanto? Is there one?
Well, Zamenhof was the first Esperantist, and he was also the first Esperanto poet. And he included 2 original poems in the very first, what's called the first book, the initial publication.
Yeah.
And they're the first poems in the language. But I think what's just as important was his insistence that poetry and literature were part of the dream, and that it was going to be a dream of a cultural advance and the building of a new culture. What's marvelous about the language of Esperanto is that Zamenhof initiated it with a lexicon of 900 roots. And when I say roots, I mean that for maximal flexibility, he decided that roots would take different vowel endings and become different parts of speech. So you get a sense of this incredible flexibility of the language, which is just tailor-made for poetry. I mean, that you can take the word blue and turn it into a verb. So the sky blues, instead of the sky becomes blue, the sky gets bluer, the sky, the sky blues. It's just a very condensed, lovely way to say it.
Have you tried writing poetry in Esperanto yourself?
I have tried. I've dabbled and experimented with it. I mean, it's just a great pleasure. I think when I read poems, I see how poets have exploited the condensation of Esperanto. And Esperanto has a considerable literature. I mean, there are thousands, tens of thousands of books. And I would say most of the literary output is in poetry for this reason. And
of course also, given the conciseness of Esperanto, that means that it's very difficult to translate that poetry into other languages.
It is, and for English speakers, we're very lucky to have the late Paul Gubbins' anthology, Star in a Night Sky, which is just a tremendous gift to English speakers. He translates Esperanto poetry into English. It's something that I don't feel moved to do, because somehow it seems like a falling off. I mean, it's much more fun to take an English poem and work it into Esperanto and just try to exploit the resources of Esperanto. And I've experimented with some translations of Elizabeth Bishop into Esperanto, just to try my hand. Difficult.
Difficult, yeah, though I would say
difficult poems.
Though she, in some sense, actually would be easier to translate than a number of other people, I would think.
Yeah, I think her genius was a genius of condensation and distilling language.
Now, when you wrote your book, it was a little bit different from your conventional scholarly book, because it was a combination of information and your interpretation of that information, and also of your own experiences, which meant that you talked quite extensively about your own immersion in the movement for Esperanto, the Esperanto movement.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I have to say that I was not an Esperantist before I started this book. I had always had a bee in my bonnet about the universal language. It always fascinated me. I had never even looked it up or gotten a book to learn, as many people have. I was interested in Zamenhof as an emancipated Jew who was really thinking outside the box, and who was sort of called both by nationalism and by universalism as a young man. He spent several years as a very activist Zionist in Warsaw. He was sort of the go-to man in Warsaw. And so I had written a biography of Emma Lazarus, the American Jewish poet, who I thought was negotiating similar tensions in her own life. She made the transit, I would say, from universalism to Zionism in her last phase of her life. And Zamenhof did the opposite. He made a transit. He said he crossed the Rubicon from Zionism to universalism. So it was going to be a biography of Zamenhof. And two things happened. And one is that I saw a photograph of Warsaw in rubble in 1945, and I realized that his library was under that rubble.
Yeah.
And the
there's
archive.
that very famous picture.
Yes, of the Esperantists standing on the house.
Yeah.
Yes. So that sent home some clarity about the state of the archive. And also I had to learn the language in order to start reading the documents, because most of them are not translated into English.
Yeah.
And I went to a 3-week immersion program at the University of California, San Diego, called NOSC, the North American Summer Course in Esperanto.
Yeah, and the Esperantic Studies Foundation, of course, is
a sponsor,
is a sponsor of it.
Sponsor of NOSC.
Yeah.
And it was just a tremendous experience. It was my first contact with the Esperanto culture and with the movement, and just seeing the variety of people that it drew and the variety of motives that impelled people into the movement, and people who simply loved the language and really didn't identify with the movement per se, but just were fascinated by the language. And I started going to congresses and to practice my Esperanto, and I thought, someone needs to write a book about this community.
Yeah.
I mean, I had never really read anything about it, just here and there.
Yeah.
So the book became a hybrid of memoir and history. It kind of zigzags between the two.
And of course, one of the most arresting things about your own experience is that the reader, as the reader reads through the book, is looking for that moment when you sort of define the Esperanto movement. It's very clear that you can't do that, and nobody can.
Yes. I mean, it's the multiplicity of it.
Yes, exactly.
And also how generative it is. I mean, the language itself, just as the language grew on the tongues of its users, I mean, who were gifted with the language. This is a very important point about Esperanto that sets Zamenhof apart from all other language inventors virtually, was that he gave the language to its users and said, you create it. It's yours. It belongs to you. I'm not the owner of the language.
Could you perhaps say that Zamenhof didn't so much invent a language as invent a language community?
Yes. I mean, I said in my book that he built a language machine to generate language.
Yeah.
But I think his vision was a vision of community.
Yeah.
But
what's machine sounds wrong.
Yes,
somehow.
I know.
Yeah.
I mean, I just wanted to convey the idea that he gave what was necessary to build a language that is equal to any situation.
Yeah.
And anything that needs to be expressed can be expressed. What's beautiful about Esperanto is that there's this space for wit and ingenuity and inventiveness. And there's a lot of playfulness when you're with Esperantists, and there's suddenly a word that isn't there, and you just coin it, and you argue about it, and all of this. You know, I think that's one of the glories of Esperanto.
One last question. So you've written about Emil Lazarus.
Yeah.
You've written about Zamenhof and the dream of an international language. One of the things that, of course, I've been involved with particularly is the translation of Tivadar Soros' Masquerade. Again, a book about essentially assimilationist Jews trying to survive in an environment where assimilation is impossible.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about Masquerade and how Masquerade fits into this bigger picture?
I mean, it's a remarkable book. It's a book I loved when I first read it. I read it in English. I read it in your translation, probably before I met you.
Could
I
be.
read it,
right.
yes.
Yeah.
I think what's remarkable about it is that it could be a book about disillusionment and bitterness. I mean, it should be a book about disillusion and bitterness. And instead, it's a book by a man with a tremendous life force and just tremendous resources of intelligence and imagination, and a literary sense. I mean, he was also someone who supported Esperanto poetry. Some of the earliest poets were Hungarian, and he was helped to publish them.
Yeah, it was one of the editors
of
the literary magazine.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, and he's a spellbinding narrator.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
really a wonderful shaper of his story, and a sense that he made room in this world of great constriction and repression and fear for life, for life itself.
Yeah.
And he's an unforgettable narrator. I mean, once you've read him, you just don't forget the book. I recommend it to all my students. I do read a lot of World War II memoirs and fiction and poetry, and it really stands out for me as just one of the books that I really cherish.
Yeah, and you're right about the optimism, I think. I think that's a remarkable characteristic of that book.
Yes, it is. Thank you for translating it so beautifully.
Well, anyway, we could be talking for a long, long time, I think.
Certainly could.
But I'm really grateful to you for telling us a little bit about many of the things you talked about in your lecture. And you have another project, right, that you are now moving on to? What are you moving on to next?
I'm writing a biography of Horace M. Callan, an American Jewish thinker, philosopher, and another man who was, I think, ahead of the curve in a lot of his ideas about cultural pluralism in the United States.
Well, as somebody, I think, yourself, who is ahead of the curve, I think that's wonderful. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Humphrey, and thank you for the invitation to lecture. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.